Chapter 3, How We Study. On the very first page of Life is Real, Gurdjieff opens the door, invites us in, and introduces us to his third series in an unusually dramatic fashion. I am... But what has become of that full sensing of the whole of myself, formerly always in me in just such cases of self-questioning during the process of self-remembering? Is it possible that this inner ability was achieved by me, thanks to all kinds of self-denial and frequent self-goading, only in order that now, when its influence for my being is more necessary even than air, it should vanish without a trace? Now that is drama, and it gives his message unusual emphasis. His first paragraph is heavy with meaning, and from that we should be full of questions. What does he mean by the full sensing of the whole of myself? What is so important about full self-sensing that it must be always in me? Always? And how does self-questioning apply? The second paragraph is even worse, because he indicates this inner ability will require much self-denial and frequent self-goading. Frequent self-goading, all kinds of self-denial, the full sensing of the whole of myself, not just sometimes but always. And, not to forget, it is more important than even air. All of that sounds extremely difficult. It sounds like incredible effort and struggle. It sounds as difficult as seeing that the whole face of the Kurd was aflame, that his eyes were streaming with tears, and that in spite of this, as if intent upon the fulfilment of his most important duty, he was eating real red pepper pods. He said to him, "What are you doing, you Jericho jackass? You'll be burnt alive. Stop eating that extraordinary product, so unaccustomed for your nature." But our Kurd replied, "No, for nothing on earth will I stop. Didn't I pay my last 2 cents for them? Even if my soul departs from my body, I shall go on eating." That scene is from Beelzebub's Tales, The Arousing of Thought. When I first read that, and for some long time afterwards, I thought Gurdjieff meant reading Beelzebub's Tales would be like eating a bag full of red pepper pods. But while that book is difficult almost beyond imagination, and may make you pull your hair and shake your head, it will not set your face aflame or fill your eyes with tears, usually. So what did he mean? Then I noticed a small item tucked into a conversation between Patriarch Knott and Ouspensky. After a while Ouspensky talked about Gurdjieff, and he asked me how I understood considering, self-remembering, self-observation, negative emotion. I said that after his accident I never heard Gurdjieff use these terms. For self-remembering he used the expression red pepper. Knott goes on to explain more of Gurdjieff's terminology, and you should read that for yourself in Journey, chapter 11. But I will stop at red pepper, because from that we know when Gurdjieff mentions red peppers, he means self-remembering, but not self-remembering as we know it. The weak brew that passes for self-remembering today resembles Gurdjieff's full sensing of the whole of myself, about as much as a pinch of mouse fur resembles a woolly mammoth. Unless your self-remembering is almost always with you, requires much self-goading and self-denying, and unless the results seem to set your face aflame and fill your eyes with tears, then you do not know Gurdjieff's self-remembering. You just know a little something about it. Instead of passing on by and stuffing more words into our minds, we should pause to ponder and grasp what he really means by such strong images as face aflame and eyes streaming with tears. What does he really mean? Well, if you have ever seen someone blush, then you have seen their face aflame. If you have experienced blushing yourself, you sense the heat of it as the blood rushes to the tissues of the face and neck. But what about the tears? Gurdjieff uses another closely related term for self-remembering and self-questioning. In the fourth talk of Life is Real, page 124, he uses cayenne pepper. The scene he paints is reminiscent of the Kurd's experience. tears included. But in Life is Real they are not just tears, but bitter tears. What could make them bitter? Perhaps regret. Most dictionaries define blush as developing a pink tinge to the face as a result of embarrassment or shame. Shame, if it is organic shame, will evoke profound regret and possibly even tears. If shame and embarrassment are involved, then there is considerably more to this thing called self-remembering than we initially notice. Also, in the Cayenne Pepper story, he goes much further. There he calls it a sacred ritual. A sacred ritual is a very big thing, far too big for us to deal with in a few paragraphs. So we will deal with that gradually, covering this topic a little here and a little there as we go along. Many students of Gurdjieff's writings may try a light form of self-remembering now and then. In reality, though, most just visit with it briefly before moving on to more interesting, easier things. But that is not enough. What then is enough? The answer that is something you will have to find it for yourself. But I'll give you my 2 cents worth. One problem we face with constant use of any terminology is over-familiarity. As Patriarch Knight points out, and Gurdjieff goes to great lengths to explain and demonstrate, with regular use any term eventually becomes frozen and lifeless. It becomes nothing more than a name. We become so familiar with the name that we assume we understand, just like everyone else, at which point it has become useless and perhaps even misleading. With that in mind, as we explore real self-remembering, perhaps a good way to begin is by using the term self-remembering less, and instead use terms that Gurdjieff, Knott and Pinder also use. Phrases like self-consciousness, self-awareness, total sensing of one's whole self, and so on. But Gurdjieff's red pepper pods is one of the best because it contains a certain seasoning missing from the others. It is a seasoning you will eventually come to understand and appreciate only by consuming large amounts of your own red peppers. We all have them, more of them, and more profound than we can imagine. They come mostly from our childhood and adolescence, and so naturally we minimise or have forgotten them. But hot though they may be, we shall have to recover and consume them. Whichever term Gurdjieff uses, we know that with self-consciousness, self-remembering, we are dealing with something that is sacred and with sufficient practice will become hot. To help free up our frozen thinking, I will now and then use some of these alternate terms, and perhaps you will come up with a few of your own. Now, if that inner ability is more important than even air, then we need to develop that ability. Why we should do so is another matter, one we will cover momentarily. But the fact is, we have not and could not have developed that ability with the information easily available for several reasons. Aside from an overly academic attitude and our blithe assumption that we already understand, which is made all but impossible by our limited third kind of reason, our neglect of developing a good ability with ongoing self-awareness is for 2 fairly distinct reasons. For one, we regard the practice of self-sensing as just one of the many tools in our overflowing tool bag, which contains the I am exercise, non-expression of negative emotions, eternal and external considering, self-observation, counting exercises, recall of the day's events, conscious labours and intentional suffering, and so on in an almost endless list, not to forget our struggles to comprehend Gurdjieff's writings. There are so many tools and tasks available that the job of fully sensing ourselves in the present moment simply gets lost in the mix. But the main reason for neglecting this inner ability is that we do not fully understand its great importance. We do not understand that a full sensing of self is the basis. It is the starting point for everything else. Gurdjieff mentions the key role of self-sensing as the enabler of the other tools several times. In the following, he clarifies its essential role while using self-observation as the example of a secondary task, one which is made possible only through the primary task of self-remembering. By the way, in the following excerpt and others, and without further warning, punctuation will be edited and emphasis added for clarity. Later, I may even tweak a word or two. Therefore, you should always verify and compare my excerpts with the original source. This is from In Search of the Miraculous, page 117-8. First, Ouspensky gives the setting, then he gives his recollection of Gurdjieff's remarks. On one occasion, at the beginning of a meeting, G put a question to which all those present had to answer in turn. The question was, what is the most important thing that we notice during self-observation? G was obviously dissatisfied with our replies. Then Gurdjieff said, "Not one of you has noticed the most important thing that I have pointed out to you. That is to say, not one of you has noticed that you do not remember yourselves." He gave particular emphasis to these words. You do not feel yourselves, you are not conscious of yourselves. With you, it observes, just as it speaks, it thinks, it laughs. You do not feel I observe, I notice, I see. Everything still is noticed, is seen. In order really to observe oneself, one must first of all remember oneself. He again emphasized these words. Try to remember yourselves when you observe yourselves, and later on tell me the results. Only those results will have any value that are accompanied by self-remembering. Otherwise, you yourselves do not exist in your observations. In which case, what are all your observations worth? If you closely review the above excerpt in the original, you will see that I have made a few slight adjustments in emphasis. That is because Ouspensky approached Gurdjieff's teachings only intellectually and seldom truly understood what Gurdjieff was saying. Naturally, he had a bit of trouble translating some of Gurdjieff's verbal inflections into written form. Perhaps you will agree with my corrections. To emphasize and reinforce Gurdjieff's remarks on the importance of self-remembering, Patriarch Knott repeats the lesson, but this time using the non-expression of negative emotions as the example. In Teachings, page 96, Patriarch Knott says, "To refrain from the expression of negative emotions can be productive of good only when it is accomplished by the effort to remember oneself. Only when one is in a state of self-remembering can negative emotion be transformed into positive emotion." It is the same with all of the tools given. Only those results will have value that are accompanied by self-remembering. Only then will the efforts we make have real meaning, hence the title of the book, Life is Real Only Then When. The full sensing of the whole of oneself is the primary tool given, and as Gurdjieff says, it is more necessary than even air. The great importance of self-awareness is difficult to even imagine, but it is essential in three major areas. As Beelzebub says in the following, page 769, it is the measure of our level of reason, it is the prime justification of our existence, and it even determines our future role in the great megalocosmos. It is necessary to tell you that concerning the determination of the degree of individuality, our cherubim and seraphim also then at the very beginning established that still now existing sacred determinator of reason, which is applied for the determination of the gradations of reason or, more exactly, the totality of self-awareness of all separate large and small cosmic concentrations, and by which not only are the gradations of their reason measured, but there is also determined their, as it is called, degree of justification of the sense and aim of their existence, and also the further role of each separate individual in relation to everything existing in our great megalocosmos. If your personal level of reason, the sense and aim of your existence, and your further role in the megalocosmos depend on your self-awareness, then what do you think? How important is it? In terms of the science of self-remembering, Gurdjieff points out its relationship with the two conscious or volitional shocks required in the process of building higher bodies. Of the second shock, he says, no serious growth, that is, no growth of higher bodies within the organism, is possible without this transmutation. But that second volitional shock must be preceded by the first. The second volitional shock and transmutation become physically possible only after long practice on the first volitional shock, which consists in self-remembering and in observing the impressions received. Therefore, the growth of higher bodies depends on long practice of self-remembering and observing the impressions received. A large part of the benefit of consciousness of self comes from observing the impressions received while in that third state of consciousness. With extended practice, some of those impressions will gradually become somewhat like red peppers. As I've said, we will return to this inner ability occasionally throughout this book. Getting back to Gurdjieff's opening remarks, even he had difficulty maintaining the full sensing of the whole of myself. For more on that, see Life is Real, pages 20 to 21. Gurdjieff had difficulty with it. I have difficulty with it, and so will you. Although difficult, achieving an almost constant possession of this third state of consciousness, Fragments, chapter 8, is necessary for real progress. This ability is the bridge from our normal state of mind to objective consciousness, and it is the first step in the further development of higher bodies. But we have missed its significance and so fail to give it the time and effort needed. While development of this inner ability will require a good bit of practice, there is a simple way to get started. Although it is simple, it is also a little awkward. A simple practice. Gurdjieff tells us of this simple method, but as usual it is given a little here and a little there in pieces. It is your job to see it, and put those pieces together to get the whole picture. Just as Gurdjieff's promise was given in pieces, this method is used in almost everything he teaches and hails back to the time of the Priory and earlier. Patriarch Knox says, "The teaching was given in fragments and often in unexpected ways, and we had to learn to put the pieces together and connect the fragments up with our own observations and experiences." Teachings. And so it is today. Some of Gurdjieff's most important lessons are given in pieces, but he usually does not tell us that, or even that it is a lesson, leaving that for you to discover. For example, he may give instruction by way of several items that are related, but without saying they are related. He may disperse them, presenting one in Beelzebub's Tales as the scientific investigation of vibrations, a second closely related piece in Life is Real as advice on the I Am exercise, and another piece as several lectures on self-remembering in both of those books. As for what ties all of those pieces together, that is up to each according to his ability to learn and apply the various devices used by Gurdjieff to accomplish his Asian mind meanings. Now, on an entirely different topic, there is something useful, perhaps even essential, in the very first advice Gurdjieff gives, which advice is stated only once, yet what he says about it assigns it a high priority. This advice is thought by some of the more disturbed among us to be a work assignment coming straight from Gurdjieff. If you will review his friendly advice at the beginning of All and Everything, you will see that he says gaining impartial judgment is a benefit of following the advice given there. Read that section carefully. Gurdjieff's advice in this method is often twisted so that his as if comes to mean not really. But in this his advice is straightforward and literal, and we should follow his advice even when reading alone. While that is correct, we seem to forget that we are never really alone. We always have little brother or little sister with us. As he says, every man is not one man, but two men, sometimes called personality and essence. Your subconscious self is always with you, but when you read in the usual fashion, it is possible that you are simply reading to you. That is to say, personalities read into personality, and there is little to be gained by that lopsided activity except to strengthen the habit and increase the already profound imbalance between our two selves. In other words, by not following Gurdjieff's advice and instead reading in our habitual manner, we may have been hindering our own progress for years. In order to make following Gurdjieff's advice more comfortable, it will be useful to find or make a place, close a door, speak with family, and explain to them what you are doing and why, so that you can study as advised without your family thinking you are becoming senile. Explain that you are following Gurdjieff's advice. Like you and everyone else who has followed Gurdjieff's advice in this, when I began, I did not understand the benefits. I thought only that it would be beneficial for little brother whose skills in that area may be less than mine. While that is true in some regards but not all, the benefit for essence is only part of it. There is more, much more. When you begin following Gurdjieff's friendly advice, it will be the same for you as for me. You will not understand either. But it is not necessary. It is not even possible to understand at that point. All that is needed is to take his advice seriously. Remember that gaining impartial judgment depends on it, and just do it. Verify, and you will see. There are several pieces to this puzzle. The first two parts mentioned are vibrations and the I am exercise. You already know a little something of vibrations. Now, and in conjunction with that, take another look at what Gurdjieff says about the I am. For the correct understanding of the significance of this first assisting exercise, it is first of all necessary to know that when a normal man, that is, a man who already has his real I, his will, and all the other properties of a real man, pronounces aloud or to himself the words I am, then there always proceeds in him, in his, as it is called, solar plexus, a so to say reverberation, that is, something like a vibration, a feeling or something of the sort. Life is Real, page 134. Thus we will be able to actually sense and focus on one of the primary factors involved when following Gurdjieff's advice when reading. As you may recall from the chapter on the Bakarian dervish, an unusually important chapter, this particular factor comes in two versions, momentum and creative. I think we can count on those made by our own eternal strings to be the creative kind. By attending to that self-generated sensation while studying as advised, we shall begin to sense the whole body more naturally and continuously. Also, and important, by this method we will avoid over-identification with the stories he tells, which, while entertaining, are not written for that purpose but to carry his detailed and written explanations. Gurdjieff says identification is the enemy of objective mentation, but he also says that self-awareness is its antidote. On page 106 of Our Life, Hartman gives us something important on the need to avoid total absorption not only in our reading but in the performance of various tasks. He says that Gurdjieff would sometimes admonish them by saying, identification, identification, meaning that we have become completely absorbed in the task. But at other times he showed us that when we really work we have to identify while leaving a little bit of attention with which to observe ourselves. And of course to observe ourselves requires self-remembering. Studying according to Gurdjieff's advice will reserve a little bit of attention for the continuous sensing of ourselves while adding a good dose of impartiality, which is necessary for correct understanding. Learning to follow this method of study consistently may sound like a small thing, and we would all like to accomplish big things, but Gurdjieff cautions otherwise. An example of a big thing many would like to accomplish is being part dog duty. But Gurdjieff says such things are too big for us. It is one of the last things to learn. On page 66 of Teachings, Gurdjieff answers a question about that duty. To bear the displeasing manifestations of others is a big thing. It is the last thing for a man. Only a man who has perfected himself can do this. Make it your aim to acquire the ability to bear one's manifestation of one person that you now cannot endure without nervousness. Setting yourself a voluntary aim and compelling yourself to achieve it creates magnetism and ability to do. See also page 96. If you are disturbed enough to take his advice as instruction, then you will make his suggestion on how to study one of your voluntary aims. And, as if all that isn't enough, Gurdjieff takes care to remind us, to emphasize the necessity of consistent self-sensing yet again, this time in meetings, when speaking of the harm done by popular literature. From Meetings, page 18. It thus accelerates in people the atrophy of even their last possibilities for acquiring those data which formerly still gave them a certain relative cognizance of their own individuality, which alone leads to what we call self-remembering oneself, that absolutely necessary factor in the process of self-perfecting. Ongoing self-awareness is not only a big thing, it is a necessity in the development of higher bodies and self-perfecting. By the way, and important to know, the ongoing full sensing of self is the first internal element of the ancient exercise Gurdjieff discovered, which he calls the chief exercise. Perhaps that is why he gives our inner ability with that skill such great emphasis, by introducing it so dramatically in the very first paragraph of the introductory book to the culmination of all of his writings, the third series. Now, the second half of Gurdjieff's opening soliloquy is at least as important as the first half, but I've decided to save the second part for later, so that we could better focus on the initial message at this time. We will look at the rest of that dramatic introduction in some detail in a chapter devoted to the health benefits of the chief exercise. But for now, let's get on with the hunt.